Welcome everyone to our last gathering for LSC 700. Deetram is away again this week, so I'll be filling in as your MC. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Todd Newman. I'm an assistant professor in LSC, and nice to join you all today. So today our speaker is going to be our very own Dr. Mike Xenos, who is a professor in the Department of Life Sciences Communication, as well as the Department of Communication Arts. Dr. Xenos' research centered on the effects of digital media on political engagement and public deliberation. His primary focus is on the extent to which the internet and social media may help individuals learn about political issues, form opinions, and participate in politics. He is also a co-principal investigator of the Science, Media, and the Public Lab, also known as SciMet, here in LSC. Dr. Xenos is also interested in the ways that political candidates, journalists, and other political actors adapt to changes in information and communication technologies and how these adaptations affect broader dynamics of political communication and public deliberation. So today, Dr. Xenos will talk about his recent work examining the role of online social networks and how individuals are exposed to and learn about science-related issues. Sure, it will be very fascinating. And if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to put them into the chat. Otherwise, we'll plan to hold Q&A for after the talk, and Ashley and I will be able to moderate that. So please join me all in welcoming Dr. Xenos, and I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Todd. And thanks, everyone. Let me just get my slideshow going and I'll start. All right. Is everyone seeing that? Yeah. Okay. So thanks for the wonderful introduction, Todd, and thank you all for tuning in. It's my distinct honor to take us into the last half of the last week of classes. I know that's going to be a bit challenging, but the topic will be engaging for people. I know that a lot of people have been spending a little bit more time on social media since the pandemic started. Many of you have probably seen these statistics of, in early pandemic, Facebook traffic goes up 27%, not quite as high as Nextdoor traffic, which surges 73%, but clearly I think a lot of people are spending a lot more time on social media. And so I hope that the talk will stimulate some thoughts and discussion around these topics. So I'll go ahead and get started. And, my topic sort of builds on this idea that, we are increasingly interested in social media in the field of science communication. Science is increasingly going social, for reasons that I think are well known to people on this call: declining legacy media coverage space, increasing online interactive spaces, more public engagement from scientists in social media spaces. But I've been studying social media and engagement for some time, and I think that it's great that we are sort of focusing on these things, but there are a number of kind of puzzles that remain, not just in looking at social media and science communication, but also in spaces where people are just looking at social media and engagement more broadly. One kind of puzzling thing, almost paradoxical, that I know very well is the research on mobilization is very clear. There's a very clear pattern of positive relationship there, including meta-analyses that show clearly we have this positive relationship between social media use and people becoming engaged, becoming active in public debates. But at the same time, to my knowledge, nobody's done the full Shelley-Boolean meta-analysis treatment of it yet, which is maybe something for people to think about. But I think if you did a meta-analysis of studies examining social media use and knowledge, you'd find almost the opposite result. We see this increasing sort of list of papers that report either a null relationship between social media use and knowledge or a negative one, kind of famously in the Cacciatore et al. Paper questioning whether Facebook is making us dumber. In the realm of science communication, we see kind of similarly puzzling patterns where, there's studies showing social media use is positively associated with trusted science, big transnational data set. Yet at the same time, we also know social media plays a significant role in scientific misperceptions. And so one of the sort of starting points for my talk and these projects is this idea that we probably have quite a ways to go before our models of social media use and engagement with science topics look like the elegant equations in the top panel. What we have now is something a little more like this, where we kind of know that there are certain variables that are important, but there are important puzzles that remain to be solved. And what I have to share today is by no means going to solve all of those problems, but it is built on the idea that we make progress in understanding these kinds of effects, these kinds of media relationships, when we turn to identifying and leveraging variables and patterns that have maybe not been looked at as deeply, or not the first ones that come to mind. And that brings me to the primary topic of today's talk, which is this thing that we're calling networked digital inequality. And we, in that statement, is myself and UW-Madison alum Matt Barnage. Matt and I have, a while back, we discovered we're both really interested in these kinds of dynamics of people having variation in their individual networks. And the way that Matt came to this, at least, is another Wisconsin connection, which is that, Matt was really taken with this blog post by another UW graduate, Kirsten Thorsen. And so many of you may know Kirsten and her work. She does these fantastic qualitative studies where she sits down with young people and structures the qualitative interview around going through their social media feed. And a couple of years ago, Kirsten sort of wrote a blog post where she tells this story of sitting down with a young woman, one of her interviewees, and it was at the height of a national election cycle season. The election was hot, everybody was talking about it. And, she gets to the point of her interview protocol where she asks the young woman, so what kinds of things about the election are people in your social media networks posting? And the person says, well, nothing. It's just all, dance moves, pop culture. And Kirsten is like, really? So how is it that everyone is talking about these sorts of things, and yet you have people who are in what she argues is a kind of digital version of this relatively contemporary concept of a news desert, where many of us, this seems foreign to us, that you wouldn't have a lot of discussion of public affairs or public issues in the social media feed, but there are these people who live in a kind of virtual version of a news desert. And so Matt and I have been sort of talking about these things and thinking about it for a while. We've built a number of projects around this idea of thinking about this as a new form of digital inequality. It's not, different from the kinds of digital inequality that are traditionally studies, inequities that arise in access, from resources, from civic skills, and so forth. But if you think about social networks as a resource, then that opens the door to thinking about the distribution of that resource. And that's what these projects are, in a way, kind of all about. And so in particular, in these projects I'm going to talk about, we're focused on key properties of online social networks. So the way we typically ask it is we sort of ask people to think about the network of people that are regularly contributing things to their social media feeds that they scroll through. And so we're focused on a few variables that I'll feature in the talk today are the size of networks, the diversity of networks, and how these things relate to patterns of incidental exposure. And so, we think about this idea of variation in social network properties. When I was talking with the person at Qualtrics who was helping us with the data collection I'm going to introduce in a minute, I was telling them, this is one of our key variables, is understanding the diversity of people's social networks in online social media platforms. And she said, really? Is there any variation? There's a kind of floating assumption that we all live in filter bubbles, that people have these homogeneous networks, well-known patterns toward homophily, and so forth. And what I said to that person, and what I'll share with you, is this idea is that there's actually more variation in online social network properties than you might think. So these data that I'm about to show come from this data collection that Matt and I put together last summer. Here are the details about the sample, but if you just sort of focus in on the first network property variable of network size, this one is a little bit less surprising to people. I think most of us kind of have this sort of understanding that, Facebook networks average around 200 or 300 maybe. There's certainly people who have smaller networks, and there's people who are maybe a bit more free in building large networks. But if you give people a question like this and ask them to respond, you get a distribution something like this, which is probably not too surprising. But when you get into diversity, I think that's when a lot of people that I share this with start to raise an eyebrow sometimes, or at least get a little bit more curious. And that is when you look at the data from these questions that, here are the ones that we asked in this survey. We have in the SciMap research group measured this variable using very similar items in the past. And there was just a collection of 5 statements with strongly disagree to strongly agree response. And if you look through them, you can see that they kind of represent, we're trying to measure the user's impression of, if you think about those people who regularly show up in the news feed, are they diverse or are they different from you on a variety of dimensions, right? So interest in politics, opinions, sort of ideological orientation, education, racial and ethnic identity. And if you look at the distribution of this, contrary to the assumption that everyone populates their social network with people who are just like them, you actually see a distribution like this. So those people who have a network that is utterly homogeneous and they disagree with all of these statements, essentially saying that, no, everyone is more or less like me, quite a small number of those represented in the strongly disagree or disagree somewhat 1 and 2 sort of buckets here. Fairly decent group in the middle, neither agree nor disagree, and then quite a large number saying in some version that yes, there are a mix of people that are populating their feed with information, postings, opinions, things like that. And I think that, this is particularly brought home if you kind of contrast it with some more traditional kind of studies of people's discussion networks. Some of you may be familiar with Diana Mutz's Hearing the Other Side. And, in Hearing the Other Side, Mutz talks about, surveys where she finds less than 25% of the respondents can think of even one person in their discussion network who has differing views from theirs. Whereas in this network or these data, if you look at the second statement, people in my newsfeed have political opinions that are very different from mine. It's an easy majority saying, yes, that's absolutely true. And so, this is kind of the first illustration of, I think this is kind of an interesting variable. It varies a fair amount, and it's also, sort of higher than I think most people would tend to think. I'm going to say a bit more about the incidental exposure variable before I go into sort of the models that I'm going to share, which is, also a very important part of this, and also very much kind of related to, in a lot of theoretical treatments, these kinds of networked properties. But if we just think about incidental exposure, this phenomenon of encountering or coming across information when you are, in the purpose of, you're in the course of using social media for other purposes, it's got a lot of interesting qualities, right? It's certainly believed to be an important mechanism for knowledge gain, for exposure to disagreeable views, perspectives. If we're interested in people understanding what people who are not like them think, typically we try to explore this through this concept of incidental exposure. And in the science context, Julian Mueller-Herbst and a number of LSC investigators, recently published this paper where we find that social media use is a positive predictor of awareness of human gene editing issues. And the assumption in the theoretical model there is that it comes from this phenomenon of incidental exposure, that you may or may not have a high interest in following the latest news in genetics or emerging genetic technologies, but if other people in your network are talking about these issues, you may be exposed to these things incidentally, and that may be why we start to see this relationship between social media use and awareness. One reason why I've been interested in incidental exposure for some time is, a lot of the work that I do is interested in what we often call compensatory effects. This graphic to the left is just kind of a hypothetical, but it shows you, if you imagine the red line representing people who are sort of high interest, either high interest in science or high interest in politics, and the blue is low interest. If you move from low diversity to high diversity, or sort of low incidental exposure to high incidental exposure, you may find this welcome phenomenon of people who may not be predisposed to become aware of or learn about certain kinds of issues on their own, but maybe if they have a friend network that's conducive to incidental exposure, you can see the reduction of knowledge gaps or other kinds of gaps that are typically found to flow from interest in online spaces. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, where, so Matt and I were thinking about these issues, trying to understand the relationship between network properties and incidental exposure, and controlling for individual characteristics that might also drive incidental exposure. And if you canvass the theoretical literature there and you try to understand, well, how might network characteristics relate to incidental exposure, while also accounting for individual preferences, there's kind of a tension in theoretical arguments, right? There's, on the one end of this sort of continuum, you have a set of assumptions that are, I think, easily derived from classic studies of discussion networks, interpersonal discussion, and so forth, that would more or less predict that if you have a large and diverse network, that would either just directly increase the odds of your being incidentally exposed to information, right? I mean, this is kind of classic wisdom of crowds, or these kinds of ideas, or maybe it's even a moderator, as you would find in that kind of compensatory effect, that you might have a certain set of predispositions that might lead you to incidental exposure, but you add in the sort of network characteristics, it might sort of help equalize patterns of information acquisition. On the other side of this, right, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's kind of a burgeoning literature of people trying to theorize incidental exposure in social media. And here's where Kirsten comes into frame once again. In that sort of space, she's actually outlined an almost opposite set of assumptions, right? Thorsen sort of develops this concept that she calls news attractiveness, and offers that up actually as kind of a replacement for sort of incidental exposure. In sort of this theoretical argument, she basically says, well, what really is more likely to be going on is that you have people with certain kinds of individual preferences. Maybe people are interested in news. Maybe people are interested in news about science. That is theorized to, in turn, lead them to craft a social network of people who are also interested in the same things, a homogeneous network of fellow folks who are interested in these sorts of things. And then when you interact with those people, you supply Facebook and Twitter or other social network platforms with all kinds of metadata that signals to the platform that you are interested in these things. And so that is what will ultimately drive incidental exposure. At the end of the day, this kind of opposite theoretical argument pretty much argues that incidental exposure in social media is not actually incidental, right? It flows originally from the individual preference. Whereas at the top end of the models, the other side of this, you might see it as a sort of separate factor, directly or indirectly contributing. So Matt had some data from the 2018 midterm election cycle. We basically derived these three different models from these theoretical arguments and tested each. It's not really a strict model comparison, but it does allow us to come to some conclusions about which of these assumptions makes the most sense if we're trying to really understand what are the factors that sort of help people become incidentally exposed to information that they weren't looking for about science or about other topics, and how does that compare to individual preferences, which are highly prized in the Thorsen account. So before we get to those kinds of relationships and the models, a logical first place to start and think about these types of things is to just go back to that first question, right? Of, well, who are the people who live in a social media news desert? Who are the people who, you know, in our data set basically are the analog to Kirsten's interview subject, who report no incidental encounters with information about public affairs. And the answer is kind of surprising, right? Not surprising to me is that there are a sizable number of folks who have this phenomenon. We found about a quarter of the sample essentially reporting no incidental news exposure through their social media feed. And if you just kind of compare that group of the desert dwellers, if you will, to the rest of the population, people who do report incidental encounters with news and other types of information, you find that they are not really the picture of the person that starts the interview that starts the story, right? The young woman, college student, I think in Southern California. You have a group of people who are distinctly male. They are more white than the sort of incidentally exposed folks. They're about 11 years older than the people who report incidental exposure. And they are of higher socioeconomic status than those who report incidental exposure. Somewhat, you know, I think a little bit of tension with the news attractiveness approach. They seem to be lower in news use outside of social media, and kind of consistent with some of the ideas I'm sort of arguing for here. They have smaller networks. Their networks are less diverse. And so that's what you're looking at when you're looking at people who may be more or less privileged on a lot of other dimensions that we think about when we think about digital inequalities. But if you think about it in terms of the richness of your network, the value of it, the amount of kind of new and stimulating information that's likely to come across the transom there, you know, this is what you get in terms of people who are low on this particular digital age resource. But let's get to the model results. And if you sort of think about, you know, I'm not going to present tables, but if you think about it in terms of just this simple premise that I'm trying to advance here, which is network characteristics are important, we do find quite a bit of support for the idea that network characteristics, particularly network diversity, is significantly related to incidental exposure rates in a variety of different ways, right? So in terms of the kind of direct effect model, we find that both size and diversity have moderate and positive direct effects. This is, you know, over and above individual preferences, your interest or lack of interest in news, other kinds of characteristics. You know, we find that, you know, measuring these things and putting them in the model does improve our ability to understand who's getting incidentally exposed. In terms of the moderation effect, we do find a moderation effect, and it particularly comes into play for the predictors of age and news use. In other words, the diversity of one's online social network is especially predictive of the rate of incidental exposure for users who are young and for users who consume a fair bit of news. I'll tell you a little bit more about sort of how that plays out in a moment. But it is also worth noting that maybe in somewhat support of, but complicated, of the news attractiveness idea, we do find more or less the strongest results for the mediation models, where you see this indirect path depicted in the lower right, where individual preferences, news use, interest, predicting sort of level of network diversity, and then in turn, that network diversity predicting levels of incidental exposure. So just from the perspective of, like I said, the very simple premise I want to advance in the talk, that network characteristics are important, network characteristics play a strong role in patterns of incidental exposure, you see a fair bit of result here that confirms this idea, or at least supports it. At the same time, however, these findings include a lot of head-scratching results that kind of evoke the sort of image from the earlier slide, right? The first thing that was unexpected is this idea of the interaction effect. So I told you that we did find you know, decent results for this idea that network characteristics might serve as a moderator between preferences and incidental exposure. But the fine print on that is that the effect is opposite of compensatory, right? In other words, network diversity amplifies rather than attenuates gaps in incidental exposure based on news use and age. And so we thought it would be something that could help compensate for kind of low news use or age patterns that sort of push into a gap. In the end, we find that the diversity is actually what magnifies those gaps. The other sort of surprising finding is that news attractiveness does turn on diversity rather than homogeneity, right? So in the theoretical formulation that Kirsten puts forward, the argument is, no, people have interest in news. That leads them to populate their network with other people who are also interested in news and very much like them, and that sort of results in incidental exposure. We find that it actually works kind of the opposite, that people who are interested in news get a diverse network, and then that diverse network boosts their incidental exposure. Kind of branching out and sort of reaching into some of the other studies that we've been sort of doing with these data and other data sets. And also, I think a number of papers that are also coming out on this, you find that network diversity is also a significant predictor of misperception and conspiratorial beliefs. And so, at the end of the day, it's kind of a mixed bag, which is a kind of familiar characterization of a lot of findings in the digital media engagement terrain, where we find that the network properties, especially diversity, are kind of highly predictive. It is important to understand that there's variation in the kinds of networks that people construct. And if you sort of look at that variable as a predictor, it does give you leverage over a lot of different outcomes, particularly incidental exposure. But we really need to do a lot more work to understand what the nature of that is, right? It's not, it doesn't seem to be the case that it works in the kind of classic way of promoting this sort of strong diversity of ideas and sort of allowing people to build on knowledge and information that they might not otherwise have. But it is definitely affecting the way that they engage with information on science and other topics. And so Matt and I are going to continue to work on these things. As I said, the findings are kind of encouraging in terms of these are important variables, but we need to do a lot more thinking to figure out exactly the best way to incorporate them into explanations of how people come to engage with science information through social media. And if you have suggestions about that, I really hope that you will share them.